My colleagues and I have worked in Tanzania and in Mongolia, and what we're looking at is trying to examine how we measure approaches to assessing autism knowledge in a cross-cultural context. There is a lot of global variability in ASD knowledge. Eric Fromberg said, well, everybody knows about autism, they talk about it, but in a lot of places, it's a new concept. For example, in Mongolia, where I spent 6 months last fall, autism wasn't even recognized until 2012. So there's a lot of variability in knowledge. The extent and availability of knowledge varies globally, obviously. There is also stigma associated with autism and autism knowledge. Autism knowledge and the stigma about autism seem to be interwoven very tightly in a lot of places.
Every time you push your button, can you push the green button as well?
The green button, I think. Yes.
I'll sort it out now.
Okay. I'm pushing the green button and nothing is happening. I really apologize. There's that. Okay, so we've done that. Okay, now that I know that I need to use 2 fingers instead of just one, perhaps we can proceed. There are also global treatment barriers, and I think we know a lot of those barriers. In many countries, there is a limited number of mental health professionals. There are few cross-cultural adapted and validated assessments. We learned a lot about that yesterday, and also some wonderful ways that we're beginning to approach that and overcome that. There is also a lot of societal stigma still associated with autism in many places, and there is limited knowledge of the disability itself. There, I got them changed at the same time. This lack of knowledge has resulted in a lack of prevalence studies. Many cultures really don't have any sort of prevalence numbers. Many countries and continents don't have these prevalence numbers, simply because the first time they try to do a prevalence study, what they might look at are medical records, and many times these medical records are either non-existent or very sparsely, they're only available in a few places. I know in Tanzania there might be some medical records in Dar es Salaam or Dodoma, some of the larger cities, but in the smaller towns and villages, these medical records don't exist. More comprehensive studies are really difficult to conduct, simply because in some areas there's a lot of stigma, and there's a lack of parental awareness about mental health issues in general, and there's poor medical infrastructure that exists in many of these countries. So a lot of this contributes to the fact that we don't have an idea of how many children and adolescents there are with ASD in a number of countries. Autism in Tanzania is interesting. Manji and Hogan in 2014 report that there's really low knowledge among public officials, among social workers, and educators. There's an unknown ASD prevalence in Tanzania. There are very few psychiatrists and psychologists and very few translated assessments, as we've discussed earlier. And there is also a limited number of schools that are really associated with serving children with ASD. The parents who do have a diagnosis for their children report that lack of public awareness of being a primary challenge to and who families that have mental illness. So The research team collaborated with a group called Connect Tanzania and with Dr. Manji of Umbili University. So we wanted to compare Tanzanian knowledge about ASD and American knowledge. So what we did, the first study examined differences in the knowledge about ASD in the United States and in Tanzania. In Tanzania, there were 19 parents or caregivers, and in America, there were 30 caregivers. And predominantly in both countries, they were the mothers. We used a version of the Autism Knowledge Survey, the AKS, and it was developed by Stone in 1997 and was revised by Sweeney in 2007. And it assesses ASD knowledge using a Likert-type scale with questions about ASD etiology, diagnosis, and treatment. And it was administered in both English and Kiswahili. So, the results. It's not too surprising that the AKS revealed that American parents had more knowledge about autism than did those in Tanzania. But there was interesting differences occurred. We would expect differences in knowledge about symptomatology and differences in knowledge about treatment. But the interesting thing is that there was no significant difference in their understanding of the etiology of ASD. And if we look at it a little more closely, we find that why were these differences in etiology? Why would parents in Tanzania and parents in the United States both know about etiology? I think we have to go back then and look at the questions that were addressing etiology. So for example, question one was that autism is an emotional disorder and is often diagnosed more often in males than females. Question 6, autism is more frequent. Okay, I screwed up. Okay, so item 6, go back to item 1. Autism is an emotional disorder. That's one. Item 6 is that it's diagnosed more often in males than females. Autism tends to also run in families. And finally, that autism occurs more commonly in high-income SES and higher educational levels. So what we found then is that the measurement issues, there's some measurement issues. The AKS is not necessarily designed for cross-cultural use. The subscales themselves are insufficient, and the items don't have that true or false answers. And there is no cutoff score for making meaning out of the scores. So what the research team decided to do was reconstruct or come up with a new measure of addressing autism awareness. We reviewed 67 published studies and identified the distinct measures of autism. We identified limitations of the existing measures in that almost every study that was done to look at autism and to look at prevalence and things, it really didn't, many of the studies did, many of the instruments really didn't meet the eligibility for established good assessments. In addition, there were limited psychometric properties, and they were not developed for cross-cultural use. So we came up with this ASQ development process. We selected 128 questions from the 17 published studies, and we created 17 newly written questions that reflected some of the qualitative themes that were not covered in the quantitative or qualitative literature. We looked, for example, at families' cultural feelings and beliefs and their understanding about autism. We looked at the prominence of concepts such as resilience, fate, morality, and karma in the parents' understanding of autism. And so we tried to focus on some of the stigma and some of the both beliefs, the coexistence of both medical and supernatural beliefs about the cause of autism. And so we did an ASQ item evaluation. We had raters of the items in 16 international researchers. They represented countries, the US, the UK, Iran, India, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Tanzania, Senegal, Cape Verde, Zambia, and I don't know how to say the last one, I'm sorry. Anyway. So what we tried to do was assess for the common components of autism. And then we wanted each researcher in their own country to look to see what terms would be relevant to their country and what reflects their background, so that hopefully the instrument could be used cross-culturally. All of the questions that we selected had a rating of at least 3.15 out of a 4-point scale. And we piloted a version that included 55 questions. The question designs we had the question statement, and then it was true, false, or they would disagree or don't know. It contained 4 knowledge scales. It looked at knowledges of symptoms and diagnosis, etiology, treatment, and then the stigma attached to the diagnosis. And it did include one screener, which is, do you have prior knowledge about autism? So there are some of the evaluation results. Essentially, we used a diagnostic classification modeling to look at the questions. It's very similar to a confirmatory factor measure. But what we figured out was that we made the assumption that the factors are categorical and not continuous, which led to some, we did, like I said, 55 total items. 45 of the items would fall into they would look at just one single domain. And then there were 9 items that would load into 2 domains, one of those being the domain of stigma. So we identified, essentially, out of our pilot measure, we identified 48 items that were very valid and were kept in the study. 6 items were removed because of some statistical concerns. And then there were 3 items that didn't seem to discriminate between those that had good autism knowledge and those that lacked the knowledge. But we kept them in because they were needed to cover some of the content. The ASQ has a good internal consistency. It has a Cronbach's alpha of 0.88. And each of the 4 subscales has a pretty decent reliability. Then the final ASKQ, what we tried to do, we changed the screening tool, the screener, from a question that says, do you have prior knowledge of autism, because that would allow some opinion to come into play. And we changed it instead to, have you ever heard of autism? We removed the don't know category because we wanted a dichotomous variable to be able to look at. So it's strictly true and false right now. And there are then our 49 total items. There are 18 items that look at diagnosis and symptomatology. There are 16 items that look at etiology, 14 items that look at treatment, and 7 items that look at stigma. And this is kind of what it looks like. There are the 48 questions, and there is an agree or disagree, and parents are asked to fill out the questionnaire. I've used this questionnaire also in Mongolia in a study, and due to some limited literacy, we reread the questionnaire to the parents, and that can easily be done as well. So finally, we do have some cutoff scores for those in the 4 categories. In diagnosis, a score between 0 and 10 could indicate that there is a lack of knowledge. Between 11 and 18, it indicates good knowledge about autism. The etiology, the score is between 0 and 10, and 11 and 16 indicates good knowledge. As far as treatment, a score of between 0 and 9 is lack of knowledge, and then 10 to 14, good knowledge. And then in stigma, a score of 0 to 2 means that you have some issues understanding the causes of autism, and 3 to 7 means that you have a clearer, more general knowledge about autism. Further research would include looking at the 11 questions that we took off the questionnaire and seeing if we can reconfigure them so that they are more meaningful. Then we also want to examine this study in a cross-cultural way. It's the instrument itself is being translated into several languages. Right now, we've got it in Malay and Arabic. We've also translated it into Mongolian. And then we want to be able to include the ASK questionnaire. We want to look at cutoff scores for teachers, for psychologists, psychiatrists, and also autism specialists. Thank you very much for listening to me today, and hope we can increase the knowledge of autism globally. So thank you.